The Maine wilderness stretched endlessly beneath the slate-gray November sky, a landscape of towering white pines and frozen earth that seemed to exist outside of time. Former Petty Officer First Class Matthew Brennan moved through the forest with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. His breath formed small clouds in the frigid air as he followed the narrow logging trail that wound through the Allagash backcountry, miles from the nearest town. Beside him, moving with the same watchful intensity, was a German shepherd named Echo. The dog's dark coat was flecked with early snow, his ears constantly rotating to catch sounds that Matthew's damaged hearing would never detect. The IED blast off the coast of Yemen had stolen 40% of his hearing and ended his career with the Coast Guard. But it had given him something unexpected, a profound appreciation for silence. And for the animals who navigated the world through senses he could barely comprehend. Matthew had been living in a cabin near Fort Kent for nearly a year now, working as a wilderness guide for veterans' recovery programs. He brought former service members out into these woods to help them find the same peace he discovered here, a place where the only explosions were falling branches, where the only missions were survival and solitude. Echo stopped suddenly, his entire body going rigid in that particular way that meant he'd caught something unusual. Not game, not another hiker. Something else. "What have you got, boy?" The dog didn't move toward whatever he detected. Instead, he sat down and looked back at Matthew with an expression that seemed almost troubled. In their 2 years together, Matthew had learned to read Echo's signals like a language. This one meant, something's wrong. Something needs attention. Matthew followed Echo's gaze into the dense forest to the east, off the established trail. The terrain there was rough, a series of steep ravines carved by ancient glaciers, filled with deadfall and thick underbrush. No one went that way unless they were lost or desperate, or hiding. Matthew checked his GPS unit and marked his position. Then he followed Echo into the trees. They descended carefully, Matthew using a walking stick to steady himself on the icy slope. His left knee rebuilt after the blast protested the angle, but he pushed through the discomfort. Echo moved ahead with purpose now, clearly tracking something specific. That's when Matthew heard it, a faint mechanical hum, so quiet he almost missed it beneath the whisper of wind through the pines. The sound was rhythmic, steady, and completely out of place in this wilderness. Echo led him down a particularly steep embankment, where the forest floor dropped away into a hidden ravine. And there, partially covered by 15 years of accumulated forest debris and snowfall, was a vehicle. Not just any vehicle. A Coast Guard utility truck, painted in the service's distinctive white and orange. The paint was oxidized and faded. The tires had rotted away completely, but the frame was still intact. And from somewhere inside came that quiet, persistent hum. Matthew's heart began to hammer against his ribs. He approached slowly, pulling away the branches and layers of decomposed leaves that had built up against the driver's side door. The window was cracked but intact, covered in grime. When he cleared enough debris to see inside, his breath caught. A skeleton sat behind the wheel, still held upright by the remnants of a seatbelt. The uniform had mostly deteriorated, but Matthew could make out the rank insignia on what remained of the collar, a chief petty officer. Coast Guard search and rescue. On the dashboard, impossibly, a small emergency beacon continued to pulse with a faint red light, its battery somehow maintaining enough charge after all these years to emit that barely audible signal. The same kind of beacon that saved lives at sea. The same kind Matthew had carried on every mission. But it wasn't the skeleton or the beacon that made Matthew's world tilt sideways. It was the name tape, still barely visible on the deteriorated uniform jacket. Brennan. His father's name. His father, who had disappeared during a search and rescue training exercise in the winter of 2008. who had been declared lost at sea when neither his body nor his vehicle was ever recovered, who had been remembered as a hero by the Coast Guard, but whose disappearance had left Matthew's family shattered, his mother broken, his younger sister angry at a father who had seemingly vanished without explanation. Matthew's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, but it was rusted solid. Echo pressed against his leg, solid and warm and real an anchor to the present moment. "Dad?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper. Whatever truth lay inside that truck, whatever had happened on that winter day 15 years ago, was about to rewrite everything Matthew thought he knew about his father's final mission. The beacon continued its steady pulse, like a heartbeat that had waited patiently through 15 winters to finally be heard. Still here, still signaling, still waiting for rescue. Part 2. The search that never ended. Matthew didn't open the truck that first day. He couldn't. Instead, he sat on a fallen log 20 feet away. Echo pressed against his side and called the one person who would understand the weight of what he'd found. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Vickers answered on the third ring. They'd served together on the USCGC Steadfast out of Portsmouth, where she'd been the operations officer and he'd been a rescue swimmer. More importantly, she'd been there the night Matthew finally broke down and told someone about the guilt he carried, the belief that if he'd tried harder, looked longer, pushed the search teams further, maybe they would have found his father. "Matt? Everything okay?" Her voice was sharp with concern. She knew his patterns. "I found something in the woods, near the Canadian border. I need you to come up here, Sarah. Off the books." There was a pause. "How far off the books?" "Bring a camera and maybe some tools. But don't file any reports." "Not yet." She arrived 5 hours later, driving up from Portland in her personal vehicle. When she saw Matthew's face, she didn't ask questions, just grabbed her gear and followed him into the forest. They descended into the ravine together, Echo leading the way with the same serious focus he'd shown earlier. When Sarah saw the Coast Guard truck, she went completely still. Then she saw the name on the uniform, and her head whipped around to stare at Matthew. "Is that my father?" "Yeah." Sarah pulled out her camera and began documenting everything: the vehicle's position, the surrounding terrain, the angle of the ravine. She worked with the methodical precision of someone trained to investigate maritime accidents. But Matthew could see the tension in her shoulders. "The official story," Matthew said, voice flat, "was that Chief Petty Officer David Brennan failed to return from a winter survival training exercise in January 2008. His truck was never found. The theory was that he'd driven onto the ice of a remote lake. The ice gave way, and the vehicle sank. After 3 months of searching, they declared him lost at sea, even though he was doing land-based training." Matthew's jaw tightened. "My mother fought for answers. We all did. But the Coast Guard closed the case. They paid out the death benefits and moved on." Sarah studied the ravine, the thick forest canopy overhead. "This is completely hidden from aerial view. And look at the angle. This ravine wouldn't have been visible from any of the training routes. He drove off the edge. In a winter storm. Probably zero visibility." She zoomed in on the steering wheel with her camera. "Look at his hands. Still gripping the wheel. He was trying to control it all the way down." Matthew forced himself to look closer. His father's skeletal hands were locked on the wheel, the bones held in place by the dried remnants of leather gloves. It was the posture of a man fighting until the very end. "He didn't get lost and drown," Matthew whispered. "He crashed. And nobody found him because nobody looked in the right place." Sarah used bolt cutters on the rusted door hinges. The metal screamed as it gave way, and the door fell open with a groan that seemed to echo through the silent forest. The smell that emerged was earthy, old, more forest than death. After 15 years, Echo whined softly and sat down. watching but not approaching. Matthew respected that. Some places even dogs knew were sacred. Sarah carefully reached inside and retrieved a waterproof case that had been secured to the passenger seat. Coast Guard issue, designed to protect critical documents and equipment. She set it on a flat rock and opened it with gloved hands. Inside were training documents, navigation charts, and weather reports from January 2008. And underneath those, a sealed plastic bag containing a small notebook and a USB drive. He was carrying evidence, Sarah breathed. Matthew's hand shook as Sarah opened the notebook. The entries were written in his father's precise handwriting, observations, times, locations, and names. Lots of names. The entries described equipment failures during training exercises that had been reported but never investigated. Life vests that didn't inflate properly. Emergency beacons that malfunctioned. Rescue equipment that was supposed to be regularly inspected but hadn't been maintained in months. "Oh my God," Sarah whispered. "Your father was documenting safety violations." Matthew looked at the dates. The entry started in October 2007 and continued right up until January 15th, 2008, 2 days before his father disappeared. The final entry read, "Meeting with IG tomorrow. Have enough evidence to force a full safety audit. Equipment failures putting crews at risk. Someone's cutting corners to save money. Need to stop this before someone dies." He wasn't just training that day, Matthew said slowly. He was going to blow the whistle on someone. Sarah connected the USB drive to her laptop. The files were encrypted, but she brought decryption software. While it worked, she continued reading the notebook. "These equipment failures, Matt. Some of these are on vessels that deployed to active rescue zones. If the safety gear failed during an actual emergency." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The laptop beeped. The files had decrypted. Inside were scanned documents, procurement records showing substandard equipment being purchased at premium prices, maintenance logs that had been falsified, inspection reports that were signed off without actual inspections taking place, and email chains, dozens of them, between a Coast Guard, supply officer, and civilian contractors. One name appeared repeatedly: Captain Robert Tanner. District Supply Officer. Matthew recognized the name immediately. Captain Tanner, now Admiral Tanner, was currently the commander of the 1st Coast Guard District, overseeing all operations from New Jersey to the Canadian border. "That's impossible," Matthew said. "Tanner's a decorated officer. He's been promoted 3 times since 2008. 15 years ago, he was in charge of procurement and equipment maintenance." Sarah's voice was tight. "And if these documents are real, he was approving substandard equipment purchases and taking kickbacks from contractors." Matthew felt the forest tilt around him. His father hadn't gotten lost in a storm. He'd been silenced. And the man responsible had spent 15 years building a career on a foundation of corruption and possibly manslaughter. "What do we do?" Matthew asked. Sarah looked at the documents, at the truck, at the remains of a man who'd tried to protect his fellow Coast Guardsmen. "We finish what he started. But carefully, Matt. If Tanner has spent 15 years covering this up, he's not going to let it fall apart without a fight." Echo suddenly stood, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Both Matthew and Sarah turned to look up the embankment. There, partially hidden in the trees, stood a figure in civilian winter gear. Too far away to identify, but close enough to have seen them at the truck. The figure stood for a long moment, then turned and disappeared into the forest. "We need to move fast," Sarah said. "Someone knows we're here." Matthew looked down at his father's remains, at the hand still gripping the wheel after 15 years. "Dad held on this long. I'm not letting him down now." But as they began securing the evidence, a cold certainty settled in Matthew's gut. His father had tried to expose corruption and had paid with his life. Someone had been content to let him rot in this ravine, to let the official story stand, and that someone now held one of the highest positions of power in the entire 1st District. Part 3. The weight of memory. Matthew didn't sleep that night. He sat in his cabin, Echo's head resting on his knee, staring at the copies Sarah had made of his father's documentation before they'd secured the originals in her personal safe in Portland. The procurement records showed a pattern of fraud spanning years of standard equipment purchased at inflated prices, with the difference presumably going into someone's pocket. But it was the notebook that haunted him. His father's handwriting, so familiar it made Matthew's chest ache. Entries detailing equipment failures that could have killed Coast Guardsmen. Observations about falsified inspection reports. And on the last page, a list of people his father had planned to contact: the Inspector General, a journalist at the Portland Press-Herald, and a congressman who sat on the House Armed Services Committee. He'd never made those calls, because 2 days later, he'd driven into a winter storm and disappeared into a ravine. Sarah had advised extreme caution. They needed to verify everything, she'd said. Build an unassailable case, then take it to the Coast Guard Investigative Service at the district level, bypassing Admiral Tanner's direct chain of command entirely. It would take time, maybe weeks. But Matthew kept thinking about the figure on the embankment. Someone knew. At 0700, Matthew's phone rang. The caller ID showed the main number for the 1st District headquarters in Boston. He answered. Brennan. Petty Officer Brennan? The voice was male, professional, with the clipped tone of someone accustomed to authority. This is Admiral Tanner's office. The Admiral was hoping you might be available for a meeting. He's traveling to the Portland sector office tomorrow and thought it would be a good opportunity to discuss your work with the Veterans Recovery Program. Matthew's instincts prickled. I'm not active duty anymore. Why would the Admiral want to meet with me? The Admiral takes a personal interest in veteran outreach programs. He's particularly interested in wilderness therapy initiatives. A pause. Would 1400 hours tomorrow work for you? At the sector office in South Portland. Matthew thought about his father's notebook, currently locked in Sarah's safe, less than 5 miles from that sector office. He thought about the figure who'd watched them from the trees. I'll be there, he said. After hanging up, he immediately called Sarah. Don't go, she said flatly. Matt, that's a trap. Maybe. Or maybe it's a chance to see how much he knows. To see if he panics. He's an admiral. He can make your life hell with a phone call. Your disability benefits. Your veterans programs. Which means he can make those things disappear, whether I meet with him or not. Matthew looked at Echo, who was watching him with those intelligent, steady eyes. Sarah, my father died in that ravine. For 15 years, nobody bothered to search beyond the official theory. His truck was a few miles from a training route, and somehow nobody thought to look there. Sarah was silent for a moment. You think Tanner had something to do with the failed search? I think my father was about to expose him. And I think Tanner had the authority to influence where search teams looked and when they stopped looking. Matthew's voice went cold. I need to see his face when I mention we found the truck. Then I'm coming with you. He can't refuse to let another officer sit in on a meeting about veteran programs. He'll know we're working together. Good. Let him know. Predators are more careful when they know their prey isn't alone. At 1300 hours the next day, Matthew received an email from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Due to a clerical error, his disability claim was being reviewed. His benefits had been temporarily suspended pending investigation. The review could take up to 6 months. Matthew stared at the email, cold fury building in his chest. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a warning shot. His phone rang an unknown number with a main area code. He almost didn't answer. Petty Officer Brennan? The voice was male, older, with a faint down east accent. You don't know me, but I knew your father. I served with Chief Brennan in 2007. My name is Dale Morrison. I'm retired now, living in Bar Harbor. But I heard through the grapevine that someone found his truck. Matthew's heart hammered. How did you? I still have friends in the service. Word travels, especially when it's something this big. Morrison's voice dropped. Listen, son, I need you to be very careful. Your father wasn't the only one who knew about the equipment fraud. There were 3 of us who started asking questions. Your father, myself, and a warrant officer named Patricia Wells. Your father disappeared. Wells died 6 months later in what they called a training accident. Fell overboard during a night exercise. I was smart enough to take an early retirement and keep my mouth shut. The man's voice cracked. I've lived with that shame for 15 years. But if you're planning to finish what your father started, you need to know what you're up against. Tanner isn't alone. He has people who've helped bury this. Then help me bring him down, Matthew said. I'm an old man with no proof and a lot of fear. But I can tell you this. Your father had a backup plan. He told me once that if anything happened to him, there was a second set of evidence, hidden somewhere at the Portsmouth base. He never told me exactly where, but he said it was where the Guardians watch over the harbor. I never figured out what he meant. The line went dead. Matthew sat in his truck, Echo watching him from the passenger seat. Where the Guardians watch over the harbor. His father had always chosen his words carefully. The Portsmouth Harbor Light Station. The old lighthouse that had guided mariners for over 2 centuries. It was now a museum, but it sat on Coast Guard property. And there was a small memorial garden there dedicated to fallen Coast Guardsmen. His father had hidden evidence in plain sight. Matthew texted Sarah. Change of plans. Meet me at Portsmouth Light before the sector meeting. And bring tools. At 13:45, his phone rang again. Admiral Tanner's office. Petty Officer Brennan, the Admiral wanted to confirm your 1400 meeting. Tell the Admiral I'll have to reschedule, Matthew said calmly. Something came up. A family matter. There was a pause. The Admiral was very specific about wanting to meet today. I'm sure he was. But I'm addressing a family matter that's been waiting for 15 years. It can't wait another day. He hung up. Echo barked one sharp alert. Matthew looked up and saw a dark sedan parked across the street from the coffee shop where he'd stopped. Tinted windows. Government plates. Watching. Yeah, buddy, Matthew murmured, starting the truck. I see them too. The hunt was on. And this time, Matthew Brennan wasn't going to let his father's truth stay buried in a frozen ravine. Part 4. The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. The Portsmouth Harbor Light Station stood sentinel at the mouth of the Piscataqua River, its white tower stark against the gray Atlantic sky. Matthew arrived just after noon, parking in the small lot reserved for Coast Guard personnel. The museum was closed for the season, and the grounds were empty, except for the gulls wheeling overhead and the crash of waves against the rocky shore. Sarah pulled in beside him 10 minutes later, carrying a backpack with tools and her camera. She'd changed into civilian clothes, jeans, and a heavy jacket, and her expression was tense. That sedan followed you from Maine, she said without preamble. Black Crown Victoria, 2 occupants. They're parked on the access road right now. Let them watch. Matthew looked toward the lighthouse. We're on Coast Guard property doing research for a veterans memorial project. Perfectly legitimate. The memorial garden was a small, carefully maintained space on the seaward side of the lighthouse grounds. Granite plaques were set into the ground, each bearing the name of a Coast Guardsman who had died in the line of duty. American flags snapped in the harsh wind off the ocean. Where the Guardians watch over the harbor. Matthew walked slowly among the plaques, reading names and dates. Most were from the modern-era helicopter crashes, vessel accidents, rescue operations gone wrong. But there was an older section, weathered stones commemorating Coast Guardsmen from decades past. Echo moved ahead, nose to the ground, searching without being asked. The dog had learned over 2 years to recognize when Matthew was hunting for something specific. "What are we looking for?" Sarah asked, photographing the layout of the garden. "Something that doesn't belong. Something my father would have known I'd recognize." Matthew's eyes scanned the plaques until he found the section from 2008. There were 3 names from that year, 2 from vessel accidents, and one that made his breath catch. Warrant Officer Patricia Wells, United States Coast Guard, died. In service, July 2008, forever on watch, the woman Dale Morrison had mentioned. The other whistleblower who died in a training accident 6 months after Matthew's father disappeared. But it was the plaque next to hers that made Matthew's hard hammer against his ribs. Chief Petty Officer Richard Peck, United States Coast Guard, lost at sea. January 2008. The faithful sentinel. There was no such person. Matthew had researched every Coast Guard casualty from 2008. Richard Peck didn't exist. "That's it," he said quietly. "You sure?" Richard Hannay is the hero from the 39 Steps, a man fighting against corrupt, powerful figures. Richard Peck is from The Riddle of the Sands, another novel about uncovering a conspiracy. Matthew knelt beside the plaque. "My father loved those old spy novels. He'd read them to me when I was a kid. This is his message." Sarah pulled out a metal detector and swept it over the ground. Immediately, it began beeping, not random noise, but a solid, sustained tone. Something's buried here. Something big. They worked quickly. Sarah used a folding shovel to cut through the frozen turf, while Matthew kept watch. The ground was harder than it had been in Maine, but about 2 feet down, Sarah's shovel hit something solid. "Got it." She cleared away more frozen earth, revealing a military-grade waterproof container, similar to the one they'd found in the truck, but larger. It was secured with a combination lock. Matthew's hand shook as he reached for it. The lock had 4 digits. He thought of his father, thought of the kinds of numbers that would mean something to both of them. His father's badge number, 7-9-3-2. The lock clicked open. Inside were 3 things: another USB drive, a thick envelope of documents, and a handwritten letter addressed to Matthew, "My son, my pride." Sarah was already scanning the area with her camera, documenting everything. "Matt, we need to move." That sedan just pulled into the parking lot. Matthew grabbed the container. The letter stayed sealed in his pocket. He couldn't read it here, not with strangers closing in. Sarah filled in the hole as best she could, while Matthew carried the evidence back to his truck. Echo was already there, standing in the truck bed, hackles raised, staring at the approaching Crown Victoria. 2 men got out, both in their 40s. Civilian clothes with the hard-eyed look of former military. One of them pulled out a phone and made a call, his eyes never leaving Matthew. "Get in," Sarah said urgently. "Drive normally. We haven't done anything wrong." But as Matthew started the engine, his phone rang. The caller ID showed a Boston number. He answered. "Brennan. Petty Officer Brennan. This is Admiral Robert Tanner." The voice was smooth, measured, no anger, no threat, which somehow made it worse. "I'm disappointed you canceled our meeting. I was hoping we could discuss your future in a productive way." "I had a family obligation, sir." "Yes, I heard you were visiting the Portsmouth Memorial Garden, paying respects to fallen Coast Guardsmen. Your father would be proud of your dedication to service." A pause, just long enough to let the words sink in. "Though I wonder if you've considered how fragile things can be. Your disability benefits, for instance. These reviews can go smoothly, or they can become complicated, especially for veterans who are struggling with the trauma of loss." Matthew's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Is that a threat, Admiral? A threat?" "No, just an observation. You've been through tremendous hardship." Losing your father, the injury from that explosion off Yemen, the difficult adjustment to civilian life. Some might say you're not in the best frame of mind to make important decisions. That grief has led you to see patterns that aren't there. The line went dead. Matthew sat there, engine running, watching the Crown Victoria in his rearview mirror. The message was clear. Back off, or I'll destroy what's left of your life and your father's memory. He just admitted it, Sarah said quietly. He practically confessed that he knows why you're digging into this. And he's betting I won't risk everything to fight him. Sarah looked at the waterproof container sitting between them. So what do? We do? Matthew thought about his father, gripping that steering wheel as the truck plunged into the ravine. Thought about Richard Peck, the fictional Coast Guardsman whose memorial marked the location of hidden truth. Thought about Warrant Officer Patricia Wells, who'd asked questions and ended up dead. He pulled out his father's letter and opened it with trembling hands. Matthew, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I'm sorry for the pain that will cause you, your sister, and your mother. But I need you to know the truth. The evidence in this container proves that Admiral Tanner and several others have been defrauding the Coast Guard for years. Substandard equipment that puts lives at risk. Falsified inspections. Kickbacks from contractors. I have everything: procurement records, emails, financial transfers. But I also have something else. Proof that they know the equipment is failing and are covering it up. 2 rescue swimmers nearly died last month because their life vest didn't inflate. The helicopter crew survived an emergency landing. Only through skill and luck their emergency beacon never activated. Good people are going to die because of this. Corruption, Matthew. That's why I can't walk away. I've hidden 2 complete sets of evidence. One at the crash site if I don't make it. One here at Portsmouth. Dale Morrison has instructions to go public if both Patricia Wells and I die under suspicious circumstances. You don't owe me this fight, son. You've served your country with honor. You've given enough. But if you choose to finish this, know that I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. Stay strong. Stay honest. And remember, the truth doesn't die just because the people who carry it do. Love, Dad. Matthew set the letter down, vision blurring. We open the container, he said, and then we burn it all down. As they drove away from Portsmouth, the Crown Victoria followed at a careful distance, not hiding, just present. A reminder that they were being watched. Echo, perched in the back seat, kept his eyes locked on the vehicle behind them, a continuous low growl vibrating in his chest. The evidence that would bring down an admiral sat between them, waiting for its moment. That moment was coming soon. Part 5. The network unravels. They didn't open the container at Matthew's cabin or at Sarah's apartment. Instead, they drove 3 hours north to a small inn in Rangeley, Maine, where they paid cash for a room that overlooked the frozen lake and had 2 exits. Matthew had learned in Yemen that when you're carrying something valuable, you need escape routes. And the journalists? Both confirmed they have the files. The Globe is running a story in tomorrow's morning edition. ProPublica is publishing online at 0600. Matthew felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. The evidence was out. Even if something happened to them now, the truth would survive. His phone buzzed. A call from a D.C. number he recognized: Congressman James Walsh, who sat on the House Coast Guard Subcommittee and had served as a Coast Guard officer himself in the 80s. Petty Officer Brennan? Walsh's voice was grim. I just finished reading the files you sent. If this is accurate, we're looking at one of the biggest fraud cases in Coast Guard history. It's accurate, sir. My father spent 2 years documenting it before he died. I'm calling an emergency hearing. Tomorrow afternoon. I want you to testify. A pause. And I want you to know that I served with your father briefly in '89. He was a good man. If he was investigating this, then I believe him. After the call ended, Matthew sat in the dark station house, listening to the waves against the rocks outside. Echo was curled up beside him, warm and solid. Sarah was on her own phone, coordinating with CG's dot at 0400. Sarah's phone rang. She listened, her face going pale, then hung up. That was Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds at CGIS. Tanner just turned himself in. Matthew stared at her. What? He showed up at CGIS headquarters in Martinsburg an hour ago with his attorney. He's claiming he's the victim of a conspiracy. Says you fabricated the evidence to get revenge for your father's death, and that the real corruption was being run by lower-ranking officers who are now trying to frame him. That's insane. The evidence is ironclad. He's a 2-star admiral with 30 years of service and powerful friends. You're a disabled veteran with PTSD. Sarah's voice was tight. He's going to try to flip the narrative. Make himself the victim and you the unstable aggressor. Matthew felt rage building in his chest, but he forced it down. Emotion wouldn't help. Evidence would. Documentation would. Truth would. Then we give them more evidence. We show them the Patton Wells death, Dad's disappearance, the equipment failures, the money trail. All of it. At 0600, the ProPublica article went live. Coast Guard Admiral accused of decades-long fraud scheme. By 0700, it was the top story on every major news site. At 0800, Dale Morrison walked into CGIS headquarters in Martinsburg with the third set of evidence and his sworn testimony. At 0900, the Coast Guard Commandant issued a statement. Admiral Tanner has been relieved of duty pending investigation. The Coast Guard takes these allegations with the utmost seriousness. At 1000, Matthew and Sarah walked into the Coast Guard Investigative Service field office in Portland, Maine, and gave their statements to a team of federal investigators. The lead investigator was a woman in her 50s, named Agent Linda Kowalski, who'd spent 20 years working financial crimes. She listened to Matthew's account, examined the evidence, and then looked at him with something like respect. Your father built one hell of a case, she said. This is as clean as any fraud investigation I've seen. Multiple evidence sources, clear documentation, independent witnesses. She paused. And Tanner's claim that you fabricated it? Impossible. Some of these documents are from secure Coast Guard systems that only he and a handful of others had access to. There's no way you could have created this. So, what happens now? Matthew asked. Now we arrest everyone involved. Tanner, his co-conspirators, the civilian contractors. Kowalski's expression was hard. And we audit every piece of equipment purchased under Tanner's authority. If there's defective gear out there putting Coast Guardsmen at risk, we find it and replace it. Sarah spoke up. What about the people Tanner silenced? The mechanic who failed the drug test, the maintenance workers who were forced to retire. We review every case. Everyone who was retaliated against gets vindication. Kowalski looked at Matthew, including your father. The Coast Guard will issue a formal exoneration. His death will be reclassified as in the line of duty, and your family will receive the benefits that should have been paid 15 years ago. Matthew felt something break open in his chest relief. Grief, vindication, all mixed together. What about Tanner's contractors? The ones who came after us? Already in custody. We picked them up an hour ago based on the traffic camera footage Ms. Vickers provided. Kowalski smiled coldly. They're being charged with assault, attempted kidnapping, and conspiracy. They're going to flip on Tanner to reduce their sentences. As Matthew and Sarah left the CGIS office, the morning sun was breaking over Portland Harbor. Coast Guard vessels moved through the water, their crews going about their duties, unaware that the corruption that had endangered them for 15 years was finally being dismantled. Matthew's phone buzzed. A text from Congressman Walsh. Hearing confirmed for tomorrow. Be ready to tell your father's story." He looked at Echo, who sat patiently beside him, tail wagging slowly. "We did it, buddy. We got him." But the fight wasn't over yet. Tomorrow, Matthew would face Tanner in a congressional hearing and make sure the world knew exactly what his father had died trying to expose. The truth was finally coming home. Part 7. The congressional hearing room in Washington was packed. Media filled the back rows, cameras positioned to capture every moment. Coast Guard officers in dress uniforms sat in the gallery, their faces carefully neutral. And at the witness table, flanked by his attorneys, sat Admiral Robert Tanner, still wearing his uniform. Though the Eagles had been removed from his car, Matthew sat in the witness waiting area, Echo at his feet, watching through a small window as the committee members took their seats. Sarah sat beside him, along with Dale Morrison and 3 other Coast Guardsmen who'd been retaliated against for reporting equipment problems. Congressman Walsh gavelled the hearing to order. His voice was stern as he read the opening statement. "This committee has convened to investigate allegations of fraud, corruption, and conspiracy within the United States Coast Guard procurement system. The evidence before us suggests a systematic pattern of criminal activity spanning nearly 20 years, resulting in substandard equipment being deployed to operational units and putting Coast Guard personnel at risk." He looked directly at Tanner. "Admiral Tanner, you have been relieved of duty pending the outcome of both this investigation and a parallel criminal investigation by the Coast Guard Investigative Service. You are here today to answer questions under oath. Do you understand?" "I do, Congressman." Tanner's voice was steady, controlled. He looked like what he was, a decorated flag officer with 3 decades of service. The uniform, even without rank insignia, still carried weight. "Let's begin with the procurement records. These documents show equipment purchased from companies that appear to exist only on paper. Can you explain this?" Tanner leaned into his microphone. "Congressman, those companies were legitimate contractors vetted through the normal procurement process. If there were irregularities in their corporate structure, that was unknown to me at the time. Unknown to you? Even though you personally signed off on contracts worth over $40 million to these companies. I signed hundreds of contracts during my time as district supply officer. I relied on my staff to conduct proper due diligence. And the bank transfers? The offshore accounts containing over $8 million traced back to you. Those accounts were established for legitimate investment purposes, properly reported on my financial disclosure forms." Walsh's expression hardened. "Admiral, we have emails between you and the contractor principals discussing bonus payments and consultation fees. We have documented equipment failures that were reported and ignored. And we have testimony from Coast Guard personnel who say they were threatened and retaliated against for reporting safety concerns. Respectfully, Congressman, those emails are being taken out of context. The equipment failures were addressed through proper channels, and any personnel actions were based on legitimate performance concerns, not retaliation." Matthew watched through the window as Tanner deflected, obfuscated, and denied. The Admiral was good, calm, reasonable, projecting an air of wounded dignity. To someone who didn't know the evidence, he might seem believable, but Walsh knew the evidence. And he wasn't backing down. "Let's talk about Chief Petty Officer David Brennan. He was investigating your activities in 2007 and 2008, was he not?" For the first time, Tanner's composure cracked slightly. "Chief Brennan was a good officer who tragically died in a training accident. I deeply regret his loss. A training accident that occurred 2 days before he was scheduled to meet with the Inspector General about equipment fraud. A training accident in which his vehicle was never found until his son discovered it 6 months ago, hidden in a ravine with all of Chief Brennan's investigative files intact." Tanner's attorney leaned in and whispered something. Tanner nodded and spoke into the microphone. I was unaware of any investigation by Chief Brennan, and I had no involvement in the search operations after his disappearance. Really? Because we have testimony from search coordinators that you specifically recommended they focus their search efforts on frozen lakes and waterways, not on land-based routes. Why would you do that? It was a reasonable assumption based on the terrain and weather conditions. Or it was a deliberate attempt to ensure his vehicle and his evidence was never found. Tanner's face flushed. That's an outrageous accusation, is it? Let's discuss Warrant Officer Patricia Wells, who was also investigating equipment irregularities. She died in a training accident 6 months after Chief Brennan disappeared. Fell overboard during a night exercise under circumstances that were never fully explained. Do you see a pattern here, Admiral? Training accidents are tragic, but not uncommon. 2 investigators, both dead within 6 months of each other, both under suspicious circumstances, both while investigating you? Walsh's voice was sharp. And then there's the mechanic who failed a drug test after reporting defective helicopter equipment. The maintenance supervisor who was forced into early retirement after documenting falsified inspection reports. The equipment specialist who was reassigned to a desk job after questioning procurement irregularities. All of them connected to your operations. All of them silenced. Tanner's attorneys were conferring rapidly. The Admiral looked cornered for the first time. Walsh leaned forward. I'm going to ask you a direct question, Admiral. Did you order, arrange, or have knowledge of any actions taken to silence, threaten, or harm Coast Guard personnel who were investigating procurement fraud? Tanner's jaw tightened. I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. The gallery erupted. Cameras flashed. Walsh gavelled for order. Let the record show that the witness has declined to answer on Fifth Amendment grounds. Walsh looked at his notes. Our next witness is former Petty Officer First Class Matthew Brennan, son of Chief Petty Officer David Brennan. Matthew stood, echo at his heel. He'd worn his Coast Guard dress uniform, the one he'd been honorably discharged in after the Yemen explosion. The ribbons on his chest told a story of service and sacrifice. The cane he carried told a story of the price paid. He walked into the hearing room, and every eye turned to him. Tanner's face went pale. Matthew took the oath, his voice steady. Then he began to speak. My name is Matthew Brennan. My father, Chief Petty Officer David Brennan, was a 22-year veteran of the United States Coast Guard. He served with honor, integrity, and devotion to duty. For 15 years, my family believed he had died in a training accident and was lost at sea. We were told there was nothing to find. We were told to move on. He paused, making eye contact with each committee member. 6 months ago, my service dog led me to my father's vehicle in a ravine in rural Maine. Inside, I found my father's remains. I also found evidence that he had spent 2 years investigating systematic fraud, corruption, and equipment procurement violations that put Coast Guard personnel at risk. He documented everything. The fake companies, the kickbacks, the falsified inspections, the retaliation against whistleblowers. Matthew placed a photograph on the witness, tabled the image of the waterproof container they'd found at Portsmouth. My father knew his investigation was dangerous, so he created backup plans. He hid evidence in multiple locations. He coordinated with other Coast Guardsmen who shared his concerns, and he prepared for the possibility that he might not survive to deliver it himself. He looked directly at Tanner. Admiral Tanner tried to silence my father. When that failed, he tried to discredit him. When that failed, he let my father's body rot in a ravine for 15 years while building his career on the foundation of the corruption my father died trying to expose. Tanner's attorney started to object. But Walsh cut him off. The witness will continue. I'm here today to finish what my father started, to make sure the truth he died protecting finally sees the light. and to ensure that every Coast Guardsman who put on the uniform after my father's death knows that when you do the right thing, when you stand up to corruption, when you refuse to be silent, when you risk everything for integrity, you will not be forgotten. You will not be abandoned. And eventually, the truth will come home. Matthew set down the letter his father had written, the one from the Portsmouth container. This is my father's final message. In it, he says he's proud of me. He says I don't owe him this fight. But he's wrong. I owe him everything. I owe him the truth. I owe him justice. And I owe him a legacy that honors the sacrifice he made. The room was silent except for the soft click of camera shutters. Walsh spoke quietly. Thank you, Petty Officer Brennan. Your father would be proud of you. Matthew nodded, unable to speak past the emotion in his throat. The hearing continued for another 4 hours, with testimony from Dale Morrison, from the retaliated against Coast Guardsmen, from forensic accountants who traced the money, and from equipment specialists who documented the failures. By the end, Tanner's defense had collapsed entirely. His attorneys requested a recess to discuss a possible plea agreement. As Matthew left the hearing room, reporters swarmed him. He gave a brief statement, thanking the committee and the Coast Guard Investigative Service, then walked out into the cold Washington afternoon. Sarah was waiting on the steps. You did it. You nailed him. We did it. You, me, Morrison, Dad. All of us. Echo pressed against Matthew's leg, and he reached down to scratch the dog's ears. His phone buzzed. A text from Agent Kowalski. Tanner's attorneys just contacted us. He's pleading guilty to all charges in exchange for cooperation in the broader investigation. You won. Matthew looked up at the gray sky over the Capitol. Somewhere beyond those clouds, he hoped his father was finally at rest. They'd brought him home. Not just his body, but his honor. His truth. His legacy. The mission was complete. Part 8. Home. The ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery took place on a cold morning in early spring, with cherry blossoms just beginning to bloom along the pathways. Matthew stood at attention as the Honor Guard 7, Coast Guardsmen in dress blues, carried his father's casket to the gravesite with slow, measured steps. The first burial, 15 years ago, had been an empty ceremony with no remains to inter. This time was different. This time, Chief Petty Officer David Brennan was truly coming home. The Commandant of the Coast Guard spoke briefly about integrity, sacrifice, and the debt owed to those who stand against corruption. Congressman Walsh attended, as did Agent Kowalski and several of the Coast Guardsmen whose careers had been saved by the investigation. Sarah stood beside Matthew in her dress uniform, and Echo sat perfectly still at Matthew's other side when the Honor Guard folded the flag from the casket and presented it to Matthew. He held it the way he'd held the evidence container, with reverence, with gratitude, with the weight of knowing what it represented. After the ceremony, an older woman approached Matthew. She was in her 70s, elegant despite her age, with kind eyes that held deep sadness. "You're David's boy," she said. "You look just like him." Matthew recognized her from photographs in his father's old albums. "Mrs. Wells, Patricia's mother. Call me Eleanor." She took his hand. "I wanted to thank you. For 15 years, they told me my Patricia drowned because she was careless, that she made a mistake during training. But I knew better. I knew my daughter. She was investigating something dangerous, and it killed her. She was helping my father," Matthew said. "They were trying to protect people. I know that now. Because of you, the Coast Guard is reopening her case. They're going to reclassify her death as in the line of duty. She'll be honored properly." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Her name will mean something again, just like your father's does." After the burial, Matthew drove north, back to Maine, back to the cabin in the woods where this had all begun. But he wasn't returning to isolation. He was returning to purpose. The Veterans Recovery Program he'd been running had expanded. With the publicity from the investigation, donations had poured in. Matthew had hired 3 more wilderness guides, all veterans, and they now had funding to serve 50 veterans per year instead of 10. And there was something else. The Coast Guard had offered him a consulting position, developing integrity and ethics training for new officers, with a specific focus on the responsibility to report corruption and the protections available to whistleblowers. The training program would be named after his father. Matthew accepted the position, not because he needed the work, but because it was the right way to honor his father's legacy. On a warm afternoon in June, Matthew stood in front of the newly dedicated Chief Petty Officer David Brennan, Center for Leadership and Ethics at the Coast Guard Academy in New London, Connecticut. The building housed classrooms, a small museum documenting the fraud case, and offices for the ethics training program. The plaque beside the entrance read, Chief Petty Officer David Brennan. Inside the room, Sarah locked the door and closed the curtains while Matthew set the container on the small desk. Echo positioned himself by the window, ears forward, watching the parking lot. The USB drive contained everything. Procurement records showing equipment purchased from companies that existed only on paper. Email chains between Tanner and civilian contractors discussing bonuses and consulting fees. Bank statements showing wire transfers to offshore accounts. And most damaging of all, internal Coast Guard, reports documenting equipment failures that have been marked resolved without any actual repairs being made. This is bigger than I thought, Sarah said, scrolling through the files on her laptop. Tanner wasn't just taking kickbacks. He was running a systematic fraud operation across multiple districts. We're talking tens of millions of dollars over 15 years. The documents also included something Matthew hadn't expected. Testimony from other Coast Guardsmen who tried to report equipment problems and been told to stay quiet. Maintenance workers who'd been reassigned or forced to retire early. A helicopter mechanic who'd filed safety complaints and mysteriously failed a drug test despite never using drugs. He's been silencing people for years, Matthew said. Not just Dad and Wells. Anyone who asked too many questions. Sarah pulled out her phone. I'm calling Chief Warrant Officer Reynolds at Coast Guard Investigative Service Headquarters. He's old school, completely clean, and he hates corruption. If we give him this evidence... Wait. Matthew was staring at one of the documents, a memo from Tanner to his co-conspirators dated January 14, 2008. 2 days before Matthew's father disappeared. The memo was marked urgent and discussed handling the CPO Brennan situation. It outlined a plan to discredit Matthew's father by claiming he was unstable, to question his mental fitness for duty, and to redirect the Inspector General investigation toward fabricated concerns about Brennan's conduct rather than equipment fraud. They were going to destroy his career, Matthew said, his voice hollow. If he'd made it to the IG, they would have claimed he was mentally unfit and buried his evidence under an avalanche of false accusations. But he didn't make it, Sarah said quietly. He drove into that ravine, and they thought the evidence died with him. So they just spread the story about him being lost at sea and moved on. Matthew pulled out his phone and called Dale Morrison. The retired Coast Guardsman answered immediately. Did you find it? We found both sets, and we need the backup you're holding. There was a long pause. Son, I'm 73 years old, and I've been hiding from this for 15 years. If we do this, we're putting targets on our backs. Tanner has powerful friends, not just in the Coast Guard, but in the defense industry, in Congress. He'd put a target on my father's back, on Patricia Wells' back. On yours, Matthew's voice was steady, cold. And I'm done letting him get away with it. Are you with me or not? Another pause. Then, Coast Guard Investigative Service Headquarters in Martinsburg, West Virginia. Tomorrow at 0800. I'll bring everything I have. Matthew hung up and looked at Sarah. We have the evidence. We have a witness. Now we just have to stay alive long enough to deliver it. I've already encrypted and uploaded copies to 3 separate secure servers, Sarah said. And I've sent encrypted summaries to 2 journalists I trust, one at the Boston Globe, one at ProPublica. If anything happens to us, the story goes public automatically. Tanner knows we found the evidence. He'll try to stop us. Let him try. We're not sneaking around anymore. We're going straight to CGIS with documentation, witnesses, and media backup. He can't bury all of us. Matthew looked at Echo, who had turned his attention from the window to stare directly at Matthew with those intelligent, trusting eyes. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You're making a serious mistake. Last chance to walk away. Think about your future. Matthew texted back. My father's future ended in a ravine because he tried to do the right thing. I'm finishing what he started. See you in court. 5 minutes later, another text arrived. This one with an attachment, a photograph of Matthew's mother's grave in the cemetery in South Portland. No message. Just the image. Sarah saw it and went pale. That's a threat. They're saying they'll desecrate her grave if you don't back off. Matthew felt something cold and implacable settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd had in Yemen when the insurgents had his team pinned down and he'd had to choose between safety and mission completion. Call the local police. Have them put a patrol on the cemetery. He opened his laptop and began typing an email. And I'm sending the complete evidence package to the Coast Guard Commandant, the Department of Homeland Security, IG, and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Right now. Before they can do anything else. Matt, we should coordinate this with CGIS. We're out of time. Tanner just threatened my mother's grave. That means he's desperate. Desperate people do drastic things. Matthew hit send on the first email, then started composing the second. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, everyone who has the authority to investigate this will have the evidence. Tanner can't stop all of them. Sarah nodded and pulled out her phone, making calls. While she coordinated with CGIS and local law enforcement, Matthew continued sending encrypted files. At 2200 hours, his phone rang. Admiral Tanner's personal cell. Matthew almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. You've made a terrible error in judgment, Petty Officer Brennan. Tanner's voice was no longer smooth. It was tight with barely controlled fury. You've sent classified material to unauthorized recipients. You've violated federal law. And you've destroyed any credibility you might have had. That material isn't classified. It's evidence of criminal activity. And I haven't destroyed my credibility. I've documented yours. You're a broken-down veteran with PTSD and a grudge. No one will believe you. They'll believe the bank records. They'll believe the procurement files. They'll believe the testimony from the Coast Guardsmen you silenced. Matthew's voice was ice cold. And they'll believe my father's investigation, which proves you've been running a corruption ring for 20 years. There was a long silence. When Tanner spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, more dangerous. Your father was a fool. He thought he could take on the system and win. Look where it got him. It got him a son who's going to finish the job. See you at the court-martial, Admiral. Matthew hung up. Echo suddenly barked sharp, urgent. Sarah ran to the window and looked out. 2 vehicles just pulled into the parking lot. 4 men getting out. They're not even trying to hide. Matthew grabbed a container with the evidence. Back exit, now. They ran. Part 6. The dead drop. The coastal Maine night was bitter cold as Matthew, Sarah, and Echo fled through the back exit of the inn and into the dense forest behind the property. Matthew's rebuilt knee screamed in protest as they scrambled down a steep slope toward the frozen lake. But adrenaline kept him moving. Behind them, voices shouted, Flashlight beams cut through the darkness. "They're not official," Sarah panted as they reached the tree line. Real CGIS agents would have announced themselves and shown credentials. Tanner's contractors. Matthew clutched the evidence container to his chest. He's panicking. They reached Matthew's truck, parked a quarter-mile away in a public fishing access lot. He'd learned in the military to always have an escape vehicle positioned away from your primary location. Old habits saved lives. Echo jumped into the truck bed, and they peeled out, headlights off, until they reached the main road. In the rearview mirror, Matthew saw the contractors emerge from the woods, too late to pursue. "Where do we go?" Sarah asked, checking her phone. "Histy's headquarters is 9 hours away. We won't make it before they set up roadblocks. We don't need to make it to Martinsburg. We just need to make it to Sunrise." Matthew turned north, toward the Canadian border. "I know a place." The place was a former Coast Guard station on a small island in Passamaquoddy Bay, abandoned since the 90s, but still accessible by a narrow causeway at low tide. Matthew had discovered it during his wilderness guide training and occasionally used it as a shelter for veterans' overnight retreats. They reached the causeway at 0200, the tide just beginning to ebb. Matthew drove across the exposed gravel path, the truck's headlights reflecting off the dark water on either side. Once on the island, he parked behind the old station house, invisible from the mainland dot inside the building. Sarah built a small fire in the ancient wood stove while Matthew checked the evidence container for the 10th time. Everything was intact. Everything was documented. Everything was encrypted and backed up to remote servers. "The emails went through," Sarah said, checking her laptop via satellite connection. The commandant's office acknowledged receipt. So did DHSIG and the Senate committee.